The morning Ellen Shepard led her last steer to the sale yard in Caldwell, Kansas. She wore her dead husband's boots because her own had finally given out at the soles, and she held her chin so high that the men along the fence line thought she was somebody important. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kishom Trail was still bleeding cattle northward like a slow wound in the earth. Caldwell sat fat and loud at the edge of Indian Territory, full of drovers and gamblers and merchants who smelled money the way dogs smell meat, and Ellen had never liked the town much. She had grown up 20 miles east on a small homestead her father had carved from the tall grass with nothing more than stubbornness and a breaking plow, and she had married Thomas Shepard at the age of 22, believing that love and hard work were enough to build a life. For a time, they had been. Thomas had been a decent man, careful with his hands and generous with his laughter, and they had built a house and a small herd and 2 sons before the fever came through in the summer of 1877, and took Thomas in the space of 4 terrible days, leaving Ellen at 29 with 8-year-old Daniel and 6-year-old Henry, 40 acres of dry grass, a leaking roof, a mortgage she could barely pronounce, and 1 aged longhorn steer she had named, against Thomas's advice, Absalom. Absalom was enormous and rust-red, and had a temper like a wet cat, and Ellen had kept him through the lean winter and the leaner spring, because she could not bring herself to let the last thing of real value go. But now October had arrived cold and mean. The root cellar held barely enough for the next 3 weeks, and Daniel had started going quiet in the way children go quiet when they understand something that hurts too much to say out loud. Henry had cried 2 nights ago because his shoes pinched, and Ellen had sat beside him in the dark rubbing his feet and promising herself she would fix it. She would fix all of it, and this was how she fixed it. She walked Absalom down the main road of Caldwell with a rope she had braided herself, and she did not cry, and she did not look away from anyone who looked at her. The sale yard was a chaos of dust and animal noise. Cattle pressed against split-rail fences, and men with hats and ledger books moved through the pens like fish through water. The auctioneer, a round, red-faced man named Dolph Crawford, took 1 look at Absalom and scratched his chin in a way that told Ellen the price would be lower than she had hoped. "Good morning, Mrs. Shepard," said Dolph, pulling at the brim of his hat. "Bringing old Absalom in, are you? He is a fine animal, no question, but he is getting on in years, and the buyers today are mostly looking for younger stock." "I know how old he is," Ellen said. "I have fed him every morning for 3 years. What will he fetch?" Dolph named a figure. It was low. It was insulting, in fact, and Ellen felt the heat climb her throat, but she kept her voice level because she needed the money and there was no point burning the only bridge she had left to stand on. "Is there room to negotiate?" she asked. "There might be, depending on the buyers. Come back at noon. We run them through at noon." She tied Absalom to a post and walked away without touching him, because if she touched him, she might not be able to leave, and she was not a woman who could afford sentimentality anymore. She spent the morning buying on credit at Haskell's General Store, a small and humbling transaction in which she explained to Ben Haskell, who had known her father, that she expected funds by the afternoon and would settle up before sundown. Ben gave her flour and salt and a tin of lard and a small bag of dried beans, and he wrote it all down in his book, and he said, "Of course, Ellen, of course," in the gentle voice people use around grief and poverty, and she thanked him and did not let her hands shake until she was outside. She sat on the bench in front of the store with a cup of coffee she had bought for 2 cents at the diner next door, and she watched the town move around her, and she thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he used to stand at the window at night and look out at the land as if he were memorizing it, and she thought that if he could see her now he would say something funny and kind, and it would make everything slightly more bearable. He had always been able to do that. She had not realized, when he was alive, how much of her courage came from having someone standing beside her. A horse came up the street at an easy pace, and the man riding it sat in the saddle the way some men are simply born to, loose and certain at once, as if horse and rider had agreed on something long ago and never needed to revisit it. He was perhaps 32 or 33, lean through the jaw and broad through the shoulders, wearing a well-kept hat over dark hair that had grown just a little too long, and he had the kind of face that was not precisely handsome, but that you wanted to keep looking at, the kind that held a story. He pulled up at the hitching rail in front of Haskell's and stepped down in one smooth movement, and Ellen would have looked away, but he happened to glance over at that moment, and he nodded at her with the automatic courtesy of a man raised to acknowledge women in doorways and on benches, and she nodded back, and that was all. He went inside. She finished her coffee. She was back at the sale yard by 11:30, standing near the fence where Absalom was penned with several other animals, when she heard the bidding begin 2 pens over. Dolph Crawford's voice rose and fell like a hymn. Numbers climbed and dropped back and climbed again. Ellen watched the men watching the animals and tried to read the room the way Thomas had taught her to, looking for the buyers with money and the buyers with ambition, and she thought she spotted a man from a large ranch south of Wichita who had come in earlier with 2 cowhands and a confident set to his shoulders. When Absalom's turn came, Ellen stood very still. Dolph ran through the animal's measurements and age and condition in a voice designed to make virtues of everything, and the bidding started. It was not a spirited bidding. 3 men raised paddles and 2 of them dropped out quickly, and then for a moment it looked as if the whole thing might land at an even lower price than Dolph had quoted that morning, and Ellen felt something drop in her chest, cold and final. Then a voice from the back of the gathered men said a number that was notably higher than where the bidding had stalled, and every head turned. It was the man from the hitching rail in front of Haskell's. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and his hat tilted back slightly on his head, and he raised the bid by enough to cause a small ripple of murmuring in the crowd. The rancher from south of Wichita narrowed his eyes and raised it back. The man from the hitching rail raised it again. The rancher paused, considered Absalom with the expression of a man doing serious arithmetic, and then shook his head once and walked away. Dolph Crawford called the sale. Absalom went to the man from the hitching rail for a price that was more than Ellen had let herself hope for, and she stood very still inside the noise of the crowd and breathed carefully and did not make a spectacle of herself. She went to collect her payment from the sale clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers who counted the bills into her hand with solemn attention to accuracy, and she folded the money carefully and tucked it inside her coat, and stood there for a moment with her hand pressed flat against it, feeling the paper beneath her palm like a heartbeat, thin and temporary and precious. "Mrs. Shepard," she turned. The man from the hitching rail was standing several feet away, holding his receipt and his hat, the hat now off his head out of some ingrained politeness she had not anticipated. "I believe that was your steer," he said, not accusing, just saying. "It was," she said. "He is yours now." "You paid a fair price." "I paid what I thought was right," he said. He had a voice that was quiet and direct, not performative, the voice of a man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he spoke it. "I noticed you watching before the bidding started. I figured it mattered to you what he went for." Ellen looked at him steadily. "It did. Thank you for what you did." He nodded, turning the hat in his hands. "Isaac Merritt," he said. "I am out of Colorado originally, working cattle down near the Cimarron these days, just passing through Caldwell on business." "Ellen Shepard," she said. "I have a place 20 miles east. My husband passed last year." The steer was the last of our herd. She did not know why she told him that last part. She had not intended to say it. Something about the directness of his gaze made her feel that pretending would be wasteful. Isaac Merritt looked at her for a moment with an expression that was careful and genuine, not pitying exactly, but attentive in the way of a person who actually hears what is said rather than waiting for a pause to speak. "I am sorry about your husband," he said. "That is a hard thing." "It is," she agreed. There was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. "I hope the money serves you well, Mrs. Shepard," he said, and put his hat back on, and she expected him to walk away, and he did. And she watched him go for exactly a second and a half before she stopped watching and turned to go settle her debt at Haskell's. She paid Ben Haskell and loaded her purchases into the back of the small wagon she had borrowed from her neighbor Ruth Carver, a widow herself of 15 years who had a better wagon and a son old enough to lend her his horses for the day. Ellen loaded everything with care and covered it with a piece of oilcloth against the dust, and she was climbing up to the seat when she heard something that stopped her with one hand on the sideboard and one foot on the step. It was a sound she knew. It was the specific low, annoyed sound that Absalom made when he was being led somewhere he had not agreed to go. She turned and looked, and there coming down the road from the direction of the sale yard was Isaac Merritt on his horse, and on a lead rope behind him was Absalom, big and red and irritable, tossing his head in the specific way he had always done when he felt underestimated. Ellen stepped down from the wagon. She stood in the road. Isaac Merritt pulled up in front of her and wrapped the lead rope once around his saddle horn, and looked at her with an expression that was straightforward and slightly uncertain, which was an interesting combination. "I came to return your steer," he said. Ellen stared at him. "I beg your pardon. I looked at him for a while after the sale," Isaac said, "and I thought about what you told me. I do not actually need this particular animal. I have been looking for younger cattle for the spring drive, and he is too old for what I have in mind, so I would rather you have him back." He reached into his coat and produced the sale receipt and held it toward her. "I do not need a return of the money, Mrs. Shepard. Consider it a gift if that word does not trouble you too much." Ellen stared at him. She stared at the receipt. She stared at Absalom, who was now watching her with his enormous dark eyes and that expression of permanent grievance that she had always found oddly endearing. "That is not right," she said. "You paid good money for him, and you paid it honestly. I am not a charity case, Mr. Merritt." "I can see that," he said, with a steady patience that was not condescension. "I am not suggesting you are. I am suggesting that I am a man who bought a steer he does not need, and that the person who would make better use of him is standing right in front of me." Ellen felt the anger come up, fast and hot, the way it always did when people tried to help her without asking, the way it had since Thomas died and every neighbor and every passing acquaintance had arrived with casseroles and pity, and the unspoken suggestion that she could not manage. She had managed. She had managed every single day. "I am not able to feed him through the winter," she said, and hated herself a little for saying it because it was an admission of what she had spent all morning trying not to display. "That is why I sold him in the first place." Isaac Merritt was quiet for a moment. Absalom pulled at the lead rope. Down the street, a door banged in the wind. "How much hay and feed would it take to get him through the winter?" he asked. "Mr. Merritt, I am asking a practical question," he said. "I have some credit at the grain dealer on the south end of town, and I have more money than I need at the moment because I sold a horse yesterday for more than he was worth to a man who wanted him for showing off. If you will allow me, I would like to arrange for feed to be delivered to your property in the amounts you specify. That is a business arrangement, not charity. The steer remains yours, the feed is yours, and I go back to my camp tonight with no animal to worry about and a cleaner conscience than I would otherwise have." Ellen looked at him for a long time. He did not flinch under the looking. He did not add to what he had said or try to soften it with smiles or flattery. He simply waited as if he had all the time in the world, and her answer, whatever it was, would be acceptable to him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He considered the question with apparent seriousness. "Because I watched a woman walk her last steer to a sale yard wearing boots 2 sizes too big and keeping her chin up the whole way," he said. "And because I think there are enough things in this world working against people like you without me being one more of them." Ellen did not speak for several seconds. She looked at the dusty street and at the oilcloth on the wagon and at Absalom, who had, in the way of cattle, forgotten that anything was happening and was attempting to eat something off the ground. She thought about Daniel going quiet in Henry's shoes and the 3 weeks of food in the root cellar. And she thought about pride and the difference between pride that strengthens a person and pride that simply makes them cold and alone. "I will need a significant amount," she said at last. "Hay and some grain. Enough for 4 months at least. I can tell you the precise figures." "Then tell me," he said, "and we will go to the grain dealer together and arrange it." They went to the grain dealer together. It was a strange and slightly formal transaction, the two of them standing at the counter while Ellen cited measurements and Isaac wrote numbers, and the dealer, a practical man named Vernon Stubbs, took down the delivery address without comment. Isaac paid from a worn leather wallet without drama, and Ellen memorized every figure because she intended to repay every cent of it, and she told him so on the way out. "You do not owe me anything," he said. "I did not say I owed you," she said, with a precision that made him look at her sharply and then, briefly, smile. "I said I intended to repay you. Those are different things. One is a debt and one is a choice." He looked at her again with that attentive quality, as if she had said something that required storing away carefully. "All right," he said. "I will not argue with that." She drove back to the Carver place to return the horses and wagon, and Isaac Merritt rode beside her at an easy pace with Absalom on the lead rope behind him, and for a while neither of them spoke, which should have been awkward and was not. The sky had turned that particular shade of Kansas blue that exists only in late October, deep and sharp as cold water, and the tall grass on either side of the road moved in the wind with a sound like distant applause. "You have people helping you with the place?" he asked after a while. "My boys," she said. "Daniel is 8, Henry is 6. They are good workers for their ages. No other family nearby. My father passed 4 years ago, my mother when I was 17. Thomas had a brother in Missouri who sent a letter of condolence and has not written since. Ruth Carver is the nearest neighbor and a good one. She brings bread sometimes and does not make me feel bad about it." "That is an art," he said. "It is. She learned it from necessity. We have all been poor at one time or another out here. You learn to give without making it feel like a wound." He was quiet for a moment. "Where are you from originally? You have an educated way of speaking." "My father was a schoolteacher before he came west," she said. "He taught me at home after the school closed down. He said reading was the one thing nobody could take from you once you had it." She glanced at him. "You are not precisely unschooled yourself." "My mother," he said simply. "She was determined." "Is she still living?" "She passed 3 years ago, my father before her." He looked at the horizon the way people look at the horizon when they are thinking about someone they miss. "I have been moving around a lot since then. Cattle work mostly. It suits me. Do you like it?" The question seemed to surprise him slightly, as if people did not often ask whether he liked what he did. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "It gets lonely, but I am good at it, and there is something to be said for work you are good at." They reached the Carver place as the afternoon light was beginning to go gold and sideways across the fields. Ruth Carver came out of the house to meet them, a small, sturdy woman of 45 with intelligent eyes and flour on her apron, and she took in Isaac Merritt with a quick and comprehensive assessment that Ellen could read like a book because she had known Ruth for years. "This is Mr. Isaac Merritt," Ellen said. "He was kind enough to help me with some business in town." "Ruth Carver," said Ruth, shaking his hand with the firm grip she gave everyone. "Will you stay for supper, Mr. Merritt? I have a beef stew that is quite adequate and plenty of it." "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Carver, but I should get back to my camp before dark," he said. He looked at Ellen. "I will ride out with Absalom as far as your property if that is agreeable, to make sure he gets home safely." Ellen agreed, though she was fairly confident Absalom could find his own way home and back again, given half a chance, since he had done it once before when she had failed to check the fence after a storm. But she said yes, and she thought about why she said yes, and she decided not to examine it too closely. They rode the last 20 miles east in the fading afternoon, Ellen on the borrowed horse with the supplies in the borrowed wagon behind her, and Isaac beside her on his horse with a name she had not yet asked. and Absalom walking behind on the lead rope with the patient, resentful dignity of an animal who has been through a great deal in one day. The boys saw them coming from half a mile away. Ellen could see them at the fence, Daniel tall and narrow like Thomas, Henry round-cheeked and watchful, and she lifted one hand and both of them waved back with both arms the way children do when they have been waiting and worrying all day, and are too relieved to contain it to a single limb. Daniel reached them first, his eyes going immediately to Absalom, and then to Isaac with the careful scrutiny of a boy who has become the oldest man on the property and feels the weight of that responsibility. "Mama, you brought him back," he said. "I did," said Ellen. "Or rather, Mr. Merritt did. Come say hello properly." Daniel said hello properly, with his hand out and his chin up, very much his mother's son. Henry appeared from behind Daniel's shoulder and looked at Isaac with the pure, uncomplicated curiosity of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to be cautious. "Are you a cowboy?" Henry asked. Isaac looked down at him from the saddle with an expression of genuine consideration, as if the question deserved genuine thought. "I work with cattle," he said. "So yes, I suppose I am. Do you have a gun?" Henry asked. "Henry," said Ellen. "I do," said Isaac, "but I have not had reason to use it in a long time, and I hope to keep it that way." Henry appeared satisfied by this response in a way that suggested it was exactly the right answer. Daniel was already helping his mother down from the horse, and Ellen handed the reins to him and reached up to untie Absalom's lead rope from Isaac's saddle. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him, "for all of it." He looked down at her in the last of the afternoon light, and there was something in that moment that Ellen could not quite name, a quality of attention that felt both comfortable and dangerous in equal measure. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Shepard," he said. "I mean that genuinely." "Will you be in Caldwell long?" she asked, and was immediately uncertain why she had asked it. "A few more days," he said. "I have some business to finish up, then probably south again." "Then safe travels, Mr. Merritt," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse south and rode away, and Ellen watched him go until he was a small shape on the horizon and the horizon swallowed him. And then she turned to her boys and her steer and the house that needed its roof patched, and she went inside to make supper. The feed arrived 2 days later in a buckboard driven by one of Vernon Stubbs's delivery men, who stacked the hay in Ellen's barn with practiced efficiency, and left without requiring anything from her except a signature in his ledger. Ellen stood in the barn after he left and looked at the stacked bales and felt something complicated pass through her. Gratitude and relief, and a small persistent anger at needing the gratitude and relief, and underneath all of that something else, something quieter and less identifiable, that she suspected had something to do with a man she had known for approximately 4 hours who had sat on his horse in the afternoon light and looked at her as if she mattered. She made herself stop thinking about it. She had a roof to patch before the rains came. Ruth Carver came by that Thursday with bread and news, as she generally did on Thursdays, and she sat at Ellen's kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about the Merritt man with the casual focus of a woman who had been gathering information since the moment he rode away. "I asked around in town a little," Ruth said. "Of course you did," said Ellen. "He has a good reputation among the cattle men," Ruth said, undeterred. "Works honestly, pays his debts, has been known to treat his horses better than some men treat their wives. He worked a season up in Colorado for the Crawford outfit, not the Crawford in Caldwell, different Crawford, and they speak highly of him. He is not a gambling man, and he is not a drinking man beyond the occasional social glass." She paused. "He is 33, never married." "Ruth," said Ellen. "I am simply sharing what I learned," said Ruth with enormous innocence. "He helped me sell a steer," said Ellen. "He is a passing traveler. That is the entire story. The entire story includes him returning the steer and arranging feed delivery," said Ruth, "which is not the behavior of a man who thinks something is finished." Ellen thought about this more than she intended to over the following days. She thought about it while she was patching the roof, balanced on the pitched surface with tar paper and nails, while Daniel handed things up to her from the ladder, and Henry kept a running commentary from the ground below. She thought about it while she was cooking, and while she was mending, and while she was doing the 100 small repairs that a homestead demanded of a person every single day. She thought about the way Isaac Merritt had listened to her, really listened, without the glazed patience of a man waiting for a woman to stop talking so he could supply the answer. Thomas had listened that way too, and she had not met many men who did. She was in the garden on a Tuesday morning, turning the last of the autumn beds for spring, when she heard a horse on the road. She stood up with the hoe in her hand and looked, and something in her chest did something quick and involuntary when she recognized the horse, a gray roan with a white blaze, which she had noticed specifically without meaning to on the day of the sale. Isaac Merritt pulled up at the fence and stepped down, and he was holding something wrapped in brown paper, and he looked slightly as though he was not entirely sure he had done the right thing by coming, which was the most human she had seen him look, and which she found unexpectedly endearing. "Mrs. Shepard," he said, "I apologize for coming unannounced. I was heading south out of Caldwell, and this road was on the way, or near enough to it." Near enough was approximately 8 miles out of the way, as Ellen knew perfectly well, but she said nothing about that. "Good morning, Mr. Merritt," she said. "Will you come in for coffee?" He came in for coffee. He put the brown paper package on the kitchen table, and she opened it while the water heated. And inside were 2 pairs of boys' shoes, small and solid, 1 pair for each of her sons judging by the sizes, clearly purchased in Caldwell because the label inside was from Harmon's Boot and Shoe Shop on Main Street. Ellen stood very still for a moment with a shoe in each hand. Then she set them down and turned to look at him where he stood at the door between the kitchen and the main room, hat in his hands, and she said, "How did you know what sizes to get?" "I asked Ruth Carver," he said. "I stopped by her place on the way out. I hope that was not too forward." Ellen looked at the shoes and then at him and then back at the shoes. They were good solid leather, well made, exactly the kind a working boy needed. She thought about Henry crying in the dark and her rubbing his feet and promising to fix it, and she felt something move in her chest that was large and warm and slightly frightening in its intensity. "Mr. Merritt," she said, "I told you I would repay you, and I will, but I want you to know that these—" She stopped, breathed carefully. "These matter very much. Thank you." "They are just shoes," he said, with a simplicity that was somehow not dismissive but rather the opposite, as if by calling them just shoes he was trying to spare her the necessity of making it a larger thing than she could easily manage. "Boys need shoes. That is all." She poured the coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, and the boys were outside doing their chores, and for a while the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the small domestic sounds of a house settling in the cold. Isaac Merritt looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of a man who was taking note of things without seeming to, and Ellen watched him look and thought about what he was seeing, the patched plaster and the worn table and the curtains she had made from feed sacks and the shelf of books above the fireplace that her father had left her. "You have a lot of books for a working homestead," he said. "My father's. I have read them all several times over. The boys are learning from them now." He got up and went to the shelf, running a finger along the spines. She watched him read the titles. "Dickens," he said. "Emerson, A Bible, Practical Geology." He glanced back at her with something that might have been a smile. "Practical Geology. Thomas bought that one. He had theories about the subsoil composition affecting drainage. He was not wrong, as it turned out." Isaac pulled Emerson out and opened it to a random page with the ease of a man who knows books and is comfortable with them. He read something silently, closed it, put it back. "My mother loved Emerson," he said. "She said he was the only philosopher who seemed to understand that the wilderness was not something to be defeated." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Ellen said. "She was," he said simply, and turned back from the shelf, and the look on his face was the look of a man who carries his grief quietly and steadily, as a necessary weight, without complaint. They talked for a long time, longer than Ellen had expected when she invited him in for coffee. They talked about the land and the weather patterns and the state of cattle prices and the trouble with the grass this year after the dry summer. They talked about Daniel's talent for fixing mechanical things, which he had inherited from Thomas, and about Henry's conviction that Absalom understood English, which was not entirely impossible given that the steer did seem to respond to his name. They talked about Colorado and about what it looked like in the early mornings when the mountains were lit with the first light, and the valleys were still full of blue shadow, and Isaac described it with a quiet, precise beauty that made Ellen want to see it very badly. They talked about the Kishom Trail and its future, which men all over Kansas were debating because the cattle towns were growing and changing, and the farmers were fencing the old routes and the old ways were already beginning to close. "Do you think it will all change?" she asked. "The whole way things are done out here?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "It is already changing. The railroad changes everything eventually. Another 10 years and the long drives will be mostly over. The men who own land and can make it work will survive. The men who just move with the cattle will have to find something else." "What will you do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "I have enough saved to buy a small piece of land. I have been looking the last year or so. Something that could be made into a working ranch, not large but solid. Cattle and maybe some crops, something permanent." He said the last word with a deliberateness that suggested it was important to him. Permanence, the thing that moving men crave eventually the way the thirsty crave water. "This is good country for it," Ellen said. "If you can get through the first 2 winters, after that the land rewards you." He looked at her directly. "I have noticed," he said. The boys came in at noon, loud and cold and immediately interested in the stranger at the kitchen table. Henry spotted the shoes with a 6-year-old's absolute radar for anything new in an environment and reached for them before Ellen could speak, and Isaac told him to try them on, and the next 10 minutes were occupied by the extremely serious business of whether the shoes fit, which they did, almost perfectly, and Henry walked back and forth across the kitchen floor with the solemnity of a judge pronouncing sentence. "They are very good," he said finally, with great authority. Daniel put his own pair on more quietly, and when he looked up there was a look in his eye that was older than 8, a measuring look. "Why did you buy these for us?" he asked Isaac, with the directness of a child who has decided that important questions should be asked plainly. Isaac met the boy's gaze without flinching and without falseness. "Because your mother is working very hard to take care of you," he said, "and I thought I could make one thing a little easier. That seemed like a good enough reason." Daniel considered this for a moment, apparently found it acceptable, and nodded once. It was the nod of a small, serious man, and Ellen, watching it, felt something ache in her chest for her son, and for the father he was so carefully trying to replace. Isaac stayed for the noon meal, which Ellen made from what she had in the house, beans and cornbread and dried apple preserves, a modest table that she set with the same care she would have given to a feast, because her mother had taught her that how you laid a table said something about how you believed people deserved to be received. Isaac ate without any of the performative appreciation that sometimes came from men who wanted to be polite and instead simply seemed to enjoy it, and he helped Daniel carry wood in afterward without being asked. And when he finally put on his hat and coat to leave, the afternoon was well advanced, and the light was that same deep October blue. Ellen walked out to the fence with him. He mounted his horse and looked down at her, and the moment held a particular kind of weight that she recognized and was not yet ready to name. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "It was a good afternoon." "It was," he agreed. "The best afternoon I have had in quite some time, if I am honest." She looked up at him. "Will you come back?" she asked, and was surprised by how easily it came out without the careful wrapping she had expected to have to put around it. He held her gaze for a moment, and the expression on his face was the most open she had seen it, unguarded and warm and something more than warm. "Yes," he said, "I will come back." He rode south and she watched him go, and this time she watched until he was entirely gone and then a little longer after that. He came back the following Saturday, which was sooner than she had expected and sooner than she tried to tell herself she had been counting on. He came in the early morning with a toolbox on the back of his horse, and he said that he had noticed the fence on the east side of the property looked like it needed attention, and if she had no objection, he would spend the morning on it. Ellen had every objection on principle and none at all in practice, and she said he was welcome to it, and she would bring lunch out at noon. He worked on the fence all morning with a steady competence that she could see from the kitchen window while she worked. A man who knew what he was doing and did it without fuss. The boys went out to help him within half an hour, both of them, and she could hear their voices drifting back to the house. Henry's high, excited chatter and Daniel's lower, careful questions and Isaac's quiet responses. And the sound of it filled up some space inside the house that had been empty and making a draft for a long time. She brought lunch out to the fence line in a basket, cornbread again and cold salt pork and a jar of cold coffee, and they sat on the grass in the thin autumn sun and ate, the four of them, and Henry fell asleep against Absalom, who had wandered over to investigate and remained to serve as an involuntary pillow. Ellen looked at her son sleeping against her steer in the yellow grass, and at Isaac watching them both with an expression that was quietly devastated with something that looked very much like tenderness. And she thought that she was in serious trouble, and that it had happened very fast, and that she was going to have to decide what to do about it. That evening, when Isaac had fixed the fence and put his tools away and the boys were inside doing their evening chores, Ellen stood with him at the fence by the road, and the light was going, and the first stars were appearing over the flat land to the east, sharp and cold and very far away. "Isaac," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and she felt the significance of it as she said it, and she thought he did too because something shifted slightly in his expression. "I need to ask you something honestly." "All right," he said. "Are you doing all of this, the steer and the feed and the shoes and the fence, are you doing it because you feel sorry for me?" she asked. "Because I can bear a lot of things. I have been bearing them for over a year, but I cannot bear being someone's project. Thomas would not have wanted that for me, and I do not want it for myself." Isaac looked at her with that steady directness that she had come to feel was one of the most honest things about him. "No," he said. "I am doing it because I want to be here, because you are the most interesting person I have met in a very long time, and because this place feels like somewhere I want to be, and because I have been moving around for 3 years telling myself that is enough, and standing in your kitchen on a Tuesday morning I realized quite suddenly that it is not." He paused. "I am not managing your difficulty, Mrs. Shepard. I am hoping you will let me be part of something worth being part of." Ellen was quiet for a moment with the cold wind moving her hair and the stars coming out over the flat grass, and she thought about all the reasons to be careful and all the arguments for waiting. And then she thought about standing in the sale yard that morning watching the bidding on her last steer, and feeling truly alone for the first time, not sad, not grieving, but alone, which was different, and something in her decided very quietly that she had been alone for long enough. "I think you had better call me Ellen," she said. He smiled. It was a real smile, slow and warm and completely unguarded, and it changed his whole face, and she thought that was the smile he had been keeping back for most of the time she had known him, and that seeing it felt like a privilege. "All right, Ellen," he said. He came back the next week and the week after. He finished the fence, and then he fixed the latch on the barn door that had been sticking since spring, and he rehung the kitchen window that had been letting cold air in around the frame. He never arrived without something useful, a tool or information, or once an entire section of new boards for the back wall of the barn, where the wood had gone soft with rot. Ellen stopped protesting the gifts after the second week, because she realized that they were not gifts in the sense of charity, but rather the actions of a man who found ways to be needed because being needed was how he knew how to begin belonging. and she understood that because she was the same way, and recognizing it in him made her feel less alone in herself. They talked every time he came. They talked about everything with the velocity of two people who have been waiting for someone to talk to and did not know it. They talked about the books on the shelf and about the land and about politics, since the state elections were coming, and there were questions about the railroads and the homestead policies that mattered enormously to people like Ellen, who held their acres by the skin of their teeth. They talked about their children, Isaac's in the hypothetical because he had none, and Ellen's in the immediate because she had two of them who were currently seeing to it that he was never bored while he worked. Daniel had appointed himself Isaac's assistant for all practical matters, and Henry had begun calling him Mr. Isaac without being asked or told, which was Henry's version of a formal acceptance. One evening in November, when the first real cold had come and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the boys were in bed and Ellen and Isaac were sitting across the table from each other with coffee between them, Isaac reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and large and careful, and he looked at her and he said, "I think I love you, Ellen. I think I have since the morning at the sale yard, which is very fast, and I am aware of that. And I am not asking you for anything right now except to know that this is true." Ellen looked at his hand on hers and at his face, and she thought about Thomas, who she had loved deeply and honestly, and she thought about the year of grief and hard ground and thin winters, and she thought about the future, which she had stopped imagining in certain terms because imagining it alone had hurt too much. And she thought about this man who had walked back to a sale yard with her steer on a lead rope because he had decided it was the right thing to do and had not needed anyone to tell him so. "I think I love you too," she said. "And yes, it is fast, but I am 30 years old and I have stopped confusing fast with wrong." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned her hand over in his and held it properly, her fingers laced through his, and the feeling of it, simple and warm and solid, was one of the best feelings she had had in a very long time. They were careful after that, careful in the way of adults who have complicated lives and children who are watching and learning. They were not reckless or hasty. Isaac continued to come on Saturdays and sometimes Wednesdays, and when he was away working he sent letters, which arrived on the twice-weekly mail run from Caldwell, and Ellen read them at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed. They were not poetic letters. They were honest and direct and specific, full of what he had seen and done and thought, and she read them several times each and then kept them in the box on the shelf beside her father's books. She wrote back, longer letters than she had intended, letters that surprised her with their own contents, the things she found herself saying when she had a page and a pen and the quietness of the night. She wrote about Daniel's growing and Henry's questions and Absalom's continued presence as a force of personality in the barn. She wrote about the land in winter, the way the sky pressed down close and gray, and the grass went silver with frost, and the house was a warm island in an enormous cold. She wrote about what she hoped for and what she was afraid of and what she thought about in the in-between hours, and she found that writing it down made the inside of her own head considerably clearer. December brought a hard freeze and a repair crisis, as December always did on any property in Kansas that was not brand new. The pump handle froze and cracked, and Ellen and Daniel spent half a day thawing the pipe and wrapping it with rags, and eventually fashioning a temporary solution that worked tolerably well. The coyotes got into the chicken coop and took 2 hens in the night, which upset Henry considerably and required Ellen to repair the coop in a wind that numbed her fingers inside the first 10 minutes. The roof held from the tar paper she had laid in the fall, which felt like a personal victory. Isaac appeared on a Thursday in mid-December with a new pump handle in his saddlebag, because he had mentioned the frozen pump in her last letter and he had thought ahead. And when she saw what he had brought, she stood in the door of the house and felt a rush of something that was larger than gratitude and larger than love and was, she thought, the feeling of being known, the specific, unreplaceable feeling of having someone who pays attention to what you say and acts on it without being asked. "You brought a pump handle," she said. "I did," he said, dismounting. "You are a very practical man," she said. "I try to be," he said. She kissed him then, which was the first time, standing in the cold morning air in the doorway of her house with his horse standing in the yard and a pump handle in his saddlebag, and two boys inside presumably about to come see what was happening. It was a brief kiss, warm and deliberate, and when she stepped back they looked at each other, and the feeling between them was so plainly mutual and so plainly good that she almost laughed. "I have been wanting to do that for 6 weeks," she said. "So have I," he said, "since approximately the sale yard." "You could have done it sooner," she said. "I did not want to presume," he said. She shook her head at him with great affection. "Get in here and fix my pump," she said, and stepped aside to let him in. Christmas that year was the best holiday Ellen had experienced since Thomas died, and she would have been embarrassed to admit how low that bar had been set and how completely Isaac cleared it. He came on Christmas Eve with gifts that were practical and thoughtful rather than impressive. A pocket knife for Daniel, who had been wanting one, and a small carved wooden horse for Henry that he had made himself one evening at his camp, working the wood by firelight. And for Ellen, a small bottle of rosewater that she suspected he had traded for rather than bought, and that she suspected he had procured through Ruth Carver's assistance, because he would not have known on his own that she had mentioned once in passing that rosewater reminded her of her mother. She kept that suspicion to herself, because the effort behind the procurement was the most touching part. They had dinner at Ellen's table, the 4 of them, and afterward the boys fell asleep by the fire, Daniel with his knife held in his hand as if he meant to keep it safe even in dreams, and Ellen and Isaac sat by the table with the last of the coffee and talked quietly for a long time. The house was warm and the fire was low and the boys were sleeping, and outside the Kansas night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and Ellen thought that this specific moment, was what she had been working toward without knowing it, through all the hard months and the thin meals and the roof repairs and the sale yard and everything, this warm, ordinary, irreplaceable moment of having someone to be quiet with. "I want to ask you something," Isaac said after a while. She looked at him. "I have been looking at a piece of land," he said carefully, "about 3 miles north of your property, 30 acres with good grass and a house that needs work but not more work than I can do. Small barn, a well that tests clean. I have enough to buy it outright and still have a working margin." He paused. "I want to put my roots somewhere. I have wanted that for a long time and I have been waiting to find the right somewhere." He looked at her with the full directness she had come to trust entirely. "I want the somewhere to be here, Ellen. Near you. I am not asking you for any commitments you are not ready to make, but I want you to know that is why I am looking here and not somewhere else." Ellen held his gaze. Outside, the wind moved through the grass and the fire shifted in the grate. Henry made a small sound in his sleep and was quiet again. "By the land," she said. He let out a breath that had been held a long time, and she could see the release of it in his whole body. "All right," he said, "but I want you to understand something," she added. "This land, this homestead, it is mine. Thomas and I built it and I have kept it and it matters to me. Whatever happens between us, I keep my land." "Of course," he said, and he said it immediately and without qualification, which was the right answer and the only acceptable answer, and she had been paying attention to see whether it would be. "And whatever happens between us," she continued, more quietly now, "involves Daniel and Henry. They have already lost one father. I will not bring someone into their lives who might leave. So if you are going to be here, Isaac, you are going to be here, not passing through." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and he held it with a steadiness that she felt all the way to her bones. "Ellen," he said, "I returned a steer in the dark of night because I could not stand the thought of you going without it. I have been driving 20 miles round trip on bad roads twice a week since October. I have learned that Henry believes Absalom can tell time, and that Daniel takes the third book on your shelf to bed with him to read by candlelight, and that you put cinnamon in your cornbread and it makes everything better." He looked at her with a seriousness that was also underneath something like joy. "I am not passing through." She believed him. She believed him entirely, and she was not a woman who gave her belief easily, which made the giving of it now feel significant and right. Isaac bought the land in January. He rode out to see it with the seller, a man named Cole Pratt, who was moving his family to town for his wife's health, and when the papers were signed and the deed was his, he rode to Ellen's property first, before he went back to Caldwell, and he stood at her fence with the deed in his hand and looked at the paper, and then at the open sky over the flat grass, and then at Ellen, who had come out to the fence when she heard him ride up. "It is mine," he said. She smiled at him, and it was not a small smile. It was one of those full, unguarded smiles that she generally kept for private moments, and she thought from the look on his face that it pleased him considerably. "Welcome home," she said. He moved onto the property in late January and spent February and March working the house into habitable condition, with the concentrated focus of a man who has a reason to hurry. Ellen and the boys came to help on Saturdays, which quickly became the best part of Ellen's week. They worked on the house, all four of them together, Daniel handing up boards and Henry bringing water and Ellen stripping old plaster and applying new, and Isaac rebuilding the kitchen from the floor upward. And in the evenings they ate together at a makeshift table in the half-finished house, and the boys fell asleep on a pile of blankets in the corner, while Ellen and Isaac planned the next week's work over lantern light. It was during one of those planning evenings in late February, with sleet on the roof and the new stove giving off generous warmth, that Isaac said quietly, "I would like to marry you, Ellen. I have wanted to say it for months, and I have been waiting for the right moment, which I have concluded is any moment when we are together. So this one will do." Ellen set down her pencil. She looked at him across the table in the lantern light, this man who had come into her life through a sale yard and a lead rope and an act of stubborn generosity, this steady, honest, attentive man who had driven back and forth through October cold twice a week because he had decided she was worth driving for. She thought about the year that had just passed, and about the woman who had walked to the sale yard in her dead husband's boots holding her chin up, and she thought about who she was now and what she wanted now and what her boys needed and what she deserved, which Thomas had always said she was allowed to have, and which she had not been very good at believing until recently. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He looked at her, and the lantern light was warm between them, and she could hear the sleet on the roof and the boys breathing in sleep in the corner, and he reached across the table and cupped her face in both hands, gently, as if she were something he valued enormously and intended to take very good care of, and he kissed her properly for the first time, warm and slow and entirely certain, and the feeling of it settled into her like the first real warmth after a long cold, sinking into the places that had been frozen and opening them up. They were married in April, when the land was beginning to green again, and the sky had lifted from gray to the high pale blue of early spring. Ruth Carver organized most of it because she had been waiting to organize it since approximately October and was not going to be denied the pleasure. The ceremony was small and practical, performed by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell every 6 weeks, held in the yard of Ellen's homestead because it was a fine day and there was no sensible reason to be inside. Ellen wore her best dress, which was good wool and a blue that matched her eyes, and she had flowers from Ruth's preserved stock pinned at her collar. Isaac wore his good coat and his clean hat, and he stood in the yard with the spring light on his face and the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he had not known he was headed and finds it better than anything he had planned. Daniel stood beside Isaac during the ceremony, having assigned himself that position without consultation, which was very Daniel. Henry stood beside Ellen and held her hand and was extremely solemn for the first minute, and then began making friends with the preacher's horse for the remaining duration, which was very Henry. They said their words in the clear spring morning, and the preacher read from his book, and the grass was coming in thick and green, and Absalom was watching over the fence with an expression of deep philosophical contemplation. And when it was done and the preacher closed his book, Ruth Carver cried happily, and everyone ate the cake she had made, which was 3 layers and required 3 kinds of flour, and was, in Ellen's opinion, an act of love so substantial it should have been recorded somewhere. They combined their properties formally that summer, breaking new fence lines to create a single large working range. Isaac's 30 acres joined with Ellen's 40 to make a parcel that was serious and workable, and they added to the herd through the summer, buying young cattle from the drives coming through Caldwell, choosing each animal with the care of people who are building something that has to last. By the end of the summer, they had a herd of 23 cattle, including Absalom, who had been granted permanent retirement from any function except personal preference, and continued to serve as Henry's confidant and occasional sleeping surface. Daniel learned cattle work with the thoroughness he brought to everything, and by September he was doing real work, not child's work, helping with the management of the herd with a seriousness that made Isaac look at him, sometimes with an expression of profound respect. He taught Daniel everything he knew, not with the condescension of an adult teaching a child, but with the straightforward generosity of a person passing along a useful skill to someone who will use it well. Daniel absorbed it all. He was Thomas's son in his carefulness and his love of understanding how things worked, and he was Ellen's son in his pride and his determination, and he was, increasingly, his own self in ways that were entirely him. Henry remained primarily Henry, which was to say that he was endlessly interested in everything, could not be in a room for 3 minutes without either breaking something or making a friend, and had the particular talent of saying exactly true things in the middle of conversations where truth was surprising. He had decided that Isaac was his father with the same total commitment he brought to all his decisions, a decision announced one morning at breakfast in a completely matter-of-fact tone that had made Ellen put down her coffee cup and look at Isaac very carefully to see how he took it. Isaac had looked at Henry for a long moment, and then said, with complete sincerity, "I would be proud of that." And Henry had nodded with great satisfaction and gone back to his breakfast, and that had been the whole transaction. The autumn of 1879 was better than the autumn before it. The harvest was not large, but it was sufficient. The root cellar was genuinely full for the first time in Ellen's recent memory, and the house was warm and sound and repaired. Ellen stood at the window one October evening and looked out at the land in the dusk light, the grass moving in the wind, the cattle shapes dark against the horizon, the light of the barn where Isaac was doing the evening feed, and she thought about the woman who had stood in this same place a year ago and felt the full weight of aloneness pressing down on her. And she thought about how much had changed, and how it had changed, and how even now she could trace the line back to a single October morning and a sale yard, and a man who had brought back a steer because he thought it was right. Isaac came in from the barn with cold hands and hay in his hair, and he stopped beside her at the window and looked out at the same view, and she leaned into his side, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in the warm kitchen watching the dark come across the land. "Are you happy?" she asked, because she was not a woman who left things unasked. He looked at the window and at the land and at her, and his expression was the most settled and open she had ever seen on a human face. "Yes," he said, "completely." She turned her face up and kissed him quickly, warmly, the easy kiss of people who have been together long enough to have easy kisses and who still want them. "Good," she said. In the spring of 1880, Ellen discovered she was expecting. She told Isaac on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, plain and direct, because that was how she said everything important, and the look that crossed his face was so unguardedly joyful that she felt her own chest fill up with it sympathetically. Joy borrowed from his joy and added to her own until there was more of it than she quite knew what to do with. "A baby," he said, as if verifying the fact. "A baby," she confirmed. He pulled her into his arms with a care that was also, underneath the care, an enormous happiness, and he held her against him with his face in her hair, and she could feel him breathing and could feel the way he held her like something infinitely precious, and she closed her eyes and was briefly completely content. They told the boys that evening. Henry was immediately and thoroughly certain it would be a girl, and began composing a list of acceptable names that he delivered at the supper table with great authority. Daniel, who was 9 and understood more about what a baby meant in terms of work and change, was quiet for a moment, and then asked seriously whether everything would be all right. And Ellen told him yes, everything would be entirely all right. And she saw in his face the small boy who had been very carefully holding himself together for a very long time, and she reached across the table and put her hand on his, and he let himself be held there briefly, before he sat up straight and nodded and said he was glad. Isaac caught Ellen's eye across the table, and the look they exchanged was the look of two people who see the same things and care about the same people. The summer of 1880 was a working summer. They expanded the barn to accommodate the growing herd, and Isaac built a second room onto the house in anticipation of the baby, and Ellen supervised the construction with the authority of a woman who has strong opinions about walls and door frames, and exactly where the window should face. Ruth Carver came over to help with the sewing of the necessary things, tiny shirts and blankets and the practical underlinings of new life, and she and Ellen sat on the porch in the summer evenings and sewed and talked in the comfortable way of women who know each other well. And Ruth said, in the tone she used when she was saying something important while seeming to say something simple, that she had not seen Ellen laugh this freely in years, and that Thomas would have been glad. And Ellen thought that was probably true and was grateful for it being said. The baby arrived in November, in a cold, clear week when the sky was very high and very blue, and he was a boy, which surprised everyone except Ellen, who had had a feeling about it since June. He was round and loud and healthy, and they named him Thomas William Merritt, Thomas for Ellen's first husband because it was right to honor that, and William for Isaac's father. Henry was mildly disappointed about the naming, but accepted it with reasonable grace, and immediately renegotiated his list for the next one, which he announced was definitely coming and would definitely be a girl. An announcement that made both adults laugh so hard that Henry felt vindicated by the attention even if not the outcome. Isaac held his son on the first night, sitting by the fire with the baby wrapped in the blue blanket Ruth had sewn, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has built everything he was trying to build and found it real and solid under his hands. He looked from the baby to Ellen, and she was watching him from the bed, tired and warm and entirely happy, and he said very quietly, "I did not know it could feel like this." "Neither did I," she said. "The second time, I mean. I did not know there would be a second time." He carried little Thomas over and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she leaned against him, and the fire was low and warm, and the baby slept between them. And outside the Kansas wind moved through the winter grass, and the cattle were in the barn, and the land was theirs, and the night was long and quiet and full of stars. And Ellen Shepard, who had walked into a sale yard one October morning in her dead husband's boots, because it was the only thing left to do, thought about pride and necessity and the strange crooked roads that led people to their lives, and she thought that the road had been hard, and she would not have wished the hard parts on anyone, but that standing here in this warm place, with this life around her, she would not trade any of it, not a single October morning, not a single mile of it. The seasons turned as they do, each one bringing its particular gifts and demands. The winter of 1881 was the coldest anyone in the county had seen in a decade, but the house held and the barn held, and the herd came through with only minor losses that were manageable. Daniel turned 10 and developed an extraordinary ability with horses that made the neighboring ranchers pay attention, and Isaac began teaching him the finer points of horse management with the same thorough generosity he brought to all his teaching. Henry turned 8 and lost his 2 front teeth in the same week, which gave him an expression of continuous hilarity that he enjoyed to the fullest extent. Thomas William Merritt was a cheerful and aggressive baby who pulled himself to standing at 9 months and took his first steps at 10 and 11 and 11 and a half, falling down each time with total equanimity and rising again immediately, which Ellen said was the most Merritt thing she had ever seen, and which Isaac did not dispute. In the spring of 1881, Ellen received a letter from Thomas's brother in Missouri, the one who had not written since the condolence letter following Thomas's death. It was a carefully written letter, somewhat awkward, asking after the boys and expressing, 3 years late, some interest in the family's welfare. Ellen sat with the letter for a day before she answered it, and her response was measured and generous, the letter of a woman who has enough security now to be able to afford generosity. She told him about the boys and about the property and about Isaac and the baby, and she said he was welcome to write to his nephews, and she meant it. Daniel, who had a specific and careful love for everything connected to his father, was quietly pleased to receive a letter from his Missouri uncle the following month. Henry was enthusiastic about having another person who would write to him. Ellen filed this as evidence that her decision had been right and moved on. The herd grew. They added a milk cow that spring, a brown and white animal that Henry named Margaret and who produced milk of extraordinary richness that made everything slightly better. They planted a proper kitchen garden with a fence against the deer, and the summer vegetables came in so well that Ellen was able to put up more jars than she had room for on the shelves, which was a problem she had never expected to have, and which she found deeply satisfying. Isaac took on a part-time role with one of the Caldwell cattle operations in the summers, working the trail for 6 weeks to bring in supplemental income, while Daniel and Ellen managed the home range. He always came back at the same time, on the day he had said he would, and the predictability of his returns was something Ellen never took for granted. She had spent enough time uncertain about the future to know that certainty was worth noticing and appreciating. By 1882, they had added a proper second room to the house for the older boys, who were 11 and 9, and in serious need of their own territory, and Isaac had built a covered porch along the south side of the house that caught the afternoon light beautifully and became Ellen's favorite place, where she did her reading and her mending and her letter writing in the long evenings. Henry's prediction came true in early 1883. Ellen was expecting again, and this time Henry was so completely certain it was a girl that he refused to entertain any alternatives. He was right. She arrived in July of 1883 with red hair that was entirely new to the family and lungs that made her opinions known from a considerable distance, and they named her Clara Ruth, Ruth for the neighbor who had been a better friend than most families, and the Ruth in question cried with such wholehearted happiness that Ellen cried too, and Isaac provided a clean handkerchief for each of them. Henry was magnificent with Clara from the first moment. He held her with the gravity of a boy who has been waiting for this specific task and is prepared to take it entirely seriously. Daniel was, in his careful way, besotted with her, which he would not have described in those terms, but which was entirely evident in the fact that he appeared in the kitchen the morning, after her arrival with a small carved wooden figure he had made himself, a deer, left on the edge of the cradle with the careful offhand placement of someone who wants to give a gift without making a fuss. Isaac watched this from across the kitchen and looked at Ellen, and she looked back at him, and neither of them needed to say anything. The land was good to them. Not always easy, not without its hard years and its worries, because the land and the weather and the cattle business did not agree to be easy simply because people worked hard and deserved it. There were bad seasons and sick cattle and broken equipment, and the ongoing struggle of the mortgage on Ellen's original property, which they eventually paid off in full in the spring of 1884. An occasion Ellen marked by standing in the kitchen and reading the paid deed 3 times over before folding it with great care and putting it in the box on the shelf next to the letters. But the difficulty was the ordinary difficulty of a life being actively lived rather than survived, and there was an enormous difference between the two, and Ellen knew the difference better than most because she had lived through the survival years and knew what it felt like to be on the other side of them. One Sunday evening in the autumn of 1884, 6 years after the sale yard morning, Ellen sat on the south porch with Isaac in the last of the light, the two of them in the chairs he had made over the winter, solid and comfortable and slightly better than strictly necessary, because he had spent extra time on the details. Little Thomas was inside being Daniel, which meant he was taking something apart to see how it worked, supervised by his oldest brother with the patient resignation of a boy who has accepted this is permanent. Clara was asleep in her cradle. Henry was in the barn telling Absalom something important, which had been a regular practice since Henry was 6 and which Absalom had apparently found acceptable for 8 years. Absalom was 12 now and moving more slowly than he once had, and Ellen sometimes watched him in the field and felt the same complicated tenderness she had always felt for him, the animal who had been the last of one chapter and the beginning of another, who had walked to a sale yard on a rope and come back in the dark to a homestead that was, without quite knowing it yet, in the process of becoming whole again. The light was going gold across the flat grass, and the sky was doing the October thing it did, that deep specific blue that Ellen had never seen anywhere except Kansas, the blue that meant cold coming and harvest done, and the particular kind of peace that follows a year of work successfully finished. "I have been thinking," Isaac said. "What about?" she asked. "About how different things could have been," he said. He was looking at the horizon with that distant look he had sometimes, the look that meant he was following something back. "If I had not gone to Caldwell that week, if I had taken the other route south, if I had not been at the sale yard that morning." "You were there," she said. "I was," he agreed. "I'm very glad I was." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he covered her hand with his in the way he always did, automatic and warm, the gesture of a man who has stopped thinking about the gesture because it has become simply the natural thing, the way you breathe or the way you reach for something in the dark and find it without looking because you always know where it is. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "I think about the walk into town that morning. I had Daniel's spare jacket on because mine had finally given out at the elbows, and Thomas's boots because my own were done, and I was leading Absalom and telling myself that selling him was practical and necessary and not the end of anything. And I believed it mostly but not completely." She paused. "I think I was afraid it was the end of something, not just the end of the herd, something larger." "Was it?" he asked, though she thought from his tone he already knew. "No," she said. "It was the beginning." He looked at her in the fading light, and his face was the face she had been looking at for 6 years and knew in the way you know something absolutely essential, every line and expression, and the particular quality of his attention when he was thinking something he was about to say. She knew what he was about to say before he said it because he was always honest with her and always had been, from the very first afternoon. "I love you, Ellen," he said. "I will probably not stop saying it, even when you already know it." "I never already know it enough," she said. "Keep saying it." He smiled and pulled her chair closer to his with one hand, so that their shoulders were touching in the evening chill, and they sat together and watched the sky go dark and the stars come out, one by one, over the land that was theirs together and that they had made into something real and lasting and good. Inside the house, Daniel called Henry in for supper, and Henry's voice called back from the barn, and there was the sound of the barn door and boots on the step, and the noise of children arriving in a kitchen that was warm and lit and ready for them. Thomas William came running to the porch door to say supper was on and looked at his parents sitting in the chairs in the dark and said, with the directness of a 4-year-old, "You are missing supper." "We are coming," said Ellen. "You are holding hands," said Thomas William, with the observation of someone who notices everything and judges nothing. "We are," said Isaac solemnly. Thomas William considered this for a moment, and then apparently decided it was acceptable and went back inside, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Ellen laughed quietly, the laugh that was entirely hers, unperformed and genuine and warm, and Isaac looked at her laughing and felt, as he always did, the particular happiness of a man who knows exactly where he is and wants to be nowhere else on earth. They went inside to supper. The kitchen was bright and noisy. Daniel had his practical, quiet efficiency at the table setting. Henry was telling everyone about what Absalom had said, which had apparently been extensive. Clara was awake now, and regarded the proceedings from the cradle with the focused suspicion of a baby, determining whether the world was up to her standards. The stove was warm and the food smelled of everything good, and the family that had gathered around this table was the family that had been built from one difficult October morning, and one act of genuine generosity, and two people who had decided, separately and then together, that the future was worth building toward with care and hope, and the kind of love that shows up in the dark, with a steer on a lead rope and a pump handle in a saddlebag, and a hand held across a kitchen table, and a whole life given freely and completely to someone who needed to know they were not alone. Ellen set the plates and called her children and sat beside her husband, and the evening opened around them like the land itself, wide and full and genuinely theirs. Outside in the barn, Absalom stood in his stall in the warm dark, old and content, listening to the distant sound of the family through the walls of the house, the voices and laughter of people who had found their way through to something worth finding, and the Kansas night stretched out around everything, enormous and cold and lit with stars, just as it always had been, and just as it would continue to be. Over the land and the grass and the small bright light in the window of the homestead where Ellen Shepard had built her life twice and found the second time, if anything, more beautiful than the first.